The temple on the screen right now is the temple for the goddess Vesta, who is the Roman counterpart to the Greek goddess Hestia. She was the goddess of the home and of the hearth, and she was worshipped primarily by female priestesses known as the Vestal Virgins. Her temple is known for having its unique shape, and it's known for the unique practices that went inside of it, or the unique rituals that were going on inside of the temple, particularly when it came to virginity. So if you follow the cardinal bird on the screen as it flies around the temple, this is just a visual to represent kind of that unique shape for the temple of Vesta. But also noting this sort of door structure to the right of the fern, there's kind of this white fern, there's kind of this white rectangle. What's also interesting about the temple of Vesta is that it was built not only in a rounded shape, but it also went along with the sunrise and the sunset. So every temple for the goddess Vesta had a door facing the east side, so that way the light would hit what was known as the fire of Vesta, which was what the Vestal virgins were in charge of protecting. So as the sun would rise in the east, the light would hit the flame and thus represent um, the sun fueling Vesta's fire and kind of representing the power of the goddess. Looking at the temple from a more topside view, we can see that the temple is very intricate. And following the bluebird on the screen, we can see that rounded temple shape. Where the bluebird is sitting now is the that is the same part of the temple that was at the beginning of the video. So that's what remains of the temple of Vesta. What's also interesting, that is what remains of the temple of Vesta. But what is also interesting is noticing from a top side view how large this place was. It has a courtyard with some water in it. It has different rooms and chambers. To the left of the bluebird, there's stairs and very intricately designed details. So this was meant to be a very well put place. It was a very high end place. It was meant to be a building that caught people's eye as they went past it, and it was specifically reserved for the Vestal Virgins who went inside of it. Um, you were on the outside, you weren't allowed in. So there was this really nice building, very intricately done, but only for a select few people were able to actually access this kind of a building. There's a few theories as to why the temple was a round shape. One of the more widely accepted theories is that it represents the earth. So the goddess Vesta is the goddess of the hearth, so the harvest, but also the home. And so the idea is that Vesta is sort of a goddess of prosperity in some ways, where um, she makes the earth prosperous. So her temple was made to be round like the earth, with her fire inside of it, representing the prosperity of Rome. Looking at the picture on the left, it kind of gives insight into what the Vestal Virgins would have been doing back in the day. So we can see the architecture is very round, representing that power, and then also the Vestal Virgins taking care of the flame, and then behind them is a shrine for Vesta. And then to the right is just a life-size statue of what the Vestal Virgins would have looked like. What's interesting is that the Vestal Virgins were, well, virgins. So because of this, they were expected to remain chaste. They would be selected at a very young age. These would be 7-year-old girls or maybe even younger, chosen to be Vestal Virgins, and they would remain that way until they were 30. So they had to remain chaste until they turned 30, and then they would be allowed to um, take up a relationship if they wanted to. But what's interesting is that the Vestal Virgins were also priestesses that were held to very high regard in Rome. They were very wealthy. They're wearing these very fancy clothing, pieces of clothing and cloth, and they were they represented a lot of the power of Rome. And so something that chastity represented to Romans back in the day was strength. It was the strength to resist the temptation of man. It was the strength to resist men, which was something that um, was seen as very powerful for women. So um, they had to maintain that purity and maintain that chastity and say, we as Vestal virgins are able to resist the temptations of men so we can serve the goddess Vesta. This is another painting that gives insight into the Vestal virgins, again, noticing that their outfits are very nice, that there's a lot of gold in the picture. The Vestal virgin, who's sort of sitting in the front, she has a gold pot with flowers, and then behind them is this large, what appears to be a golden statue of what would probably be Vesta. But then I also think that it's interesting to look at the Vestal virgin kind of in the back, just looking at the fire, just sort of looking bored, like, oh, gotta look at the fire again. Um, these were very wealthy and high honored women, and they were tasked with maintaining the fire, which is what the Vestal virgins are doing in this picture. By maintaining the fire, they were, in a way, maintaining a symbol of Rome's power, a symbol of their goddess's power, and reflecting this idea that we have this high honor, that we are going to remain pure for it, we are going to live our lives a certain way for it until we turn 30 and represent that power in Rome. What's interesting about the Vestal virgins is that they were the only women in Rome punished for losing their virginity. So if a Vestal virgin had been found caught in relations, she would be buried alive, which is sort of the very dark painting here. It's Torture of the Virgin by Henry Pierre Danlou. Um, is sort of this very dark image of the last sunlight that this girl would see. So this was something that Rome took very seriously. If someone was a Vestal virgin, they remained chaste, and if they didn't, they died. But outside of that, women were somewhat liberated. Usually women who were very prominent in society, so such as priestesses or daughters of very wealthy men, they were supposed to remain chaste because that was seen as very pure and that was seen as very high end, but it wasn't a life or death sort of situation. But it was if you were a priestess of the temple of Vesta. So just some final images of the temple of the Vestal virgins and just who the Vestal virgins were. What this shows is that the temple, as I've said before, I keep saying that it represents power, it represents this sort of divine feminine energy, it represents purity, of course, and it represents a lot of this strength of Rome. The architecture was made the architecture was meant to be very to stand out. It was meant to be very strong architecture. It was meant to say this is a temple that everyone was going to see when they saw it because of its unique circular shape. So, all of this was about being a display of power. So, it was architecture reflecting power in Rome, it was architecture representing the importance of a specific goddess in Rome, and it was architecture reflecting um, how important these women would have been. This temple was very specifically designed for these Vestal virgins. It was their space, it was their temple. So their chastity and all that also being representative of that power sort of shows that there's a cultural practice that's meant to represent power and purity and holiness, and then there's architecture that was designed to represent power and purity and holiness. So it sort of just goes to show architecture reflecting a cultural idea that um, that the goddess Vesta um, is a very prominent goddess and that she needs a very unique temple to be worshipped. And then also that Rome is very powerful and all of that. But then it also represents a biological practice or relates to a biological practice that chastity also represents those things, that it represents power, it represents purity, it represents um, relations to this goddess. And so, again, it just serves as an example of how architecture in antiquity would represent cultural views and biological practices.